The morning I realized I might lose my grandson, I was standing in my kitchen in Sudbury, still in my housecoat, reading the same paragraph of the specialist's letter for the fourth time. Diffuse large B-cell lymphoma. Aggressive. Requiring immediate intervention. My grandson was 11 years old and he loved hockey and hated broccoli and called me every Sunday evening without fail. And somewhere inside that small, stubborn body, something was trying to destroy him. I set the letter down on the counter next to my cold tea and I looked out at the backyard. The birch tree his grandfather had planted the year my daughter was born, the old swing still hanging there, rusted now, barely used. I had lived in this house for 31 years. I knew every creak in the floor, every draft in winter, every smell of that kitchen. And in that moment, standing there in February, I felt like a stranger in it. The treatment my grandson needed wasn't available through OHIP. Not fully. His oncologist had recommended a clinical trial at a hospital in Montreal, a CAR T-cell therapy program. The cost of the supplementary care, the extended stays, the medications not yet covered under the provincial formulary, my daughter had done the math. $280,000. She didn't ask me for it. She would never ask me. She's like her father that way. Too proud to say the thing that needs saying. But I saw it on her face when she came to tell me, that look. The one that means she's already started making peace with something she can't change. I couldn't make peace with it. I was a retired high school librarian. I had a decent pension, a paid-off house, and a savings account that would have been respectable 30 years ago. I was not a woman who could write a check for $280,000. But I was a woman who could figure something out. I want to say that clearly because what I decided to do next, I won't pretend it was dignified. I won't pretend I didn't lie awake for 3 nights before I made the call. But I also won't pretend I had another option, because I looked. I called every number. I filled out every form. The timelines were too long. The bureaucracy was indifferent. My grandson did not have the luxury of waiting for a committee to meet. It was my former colleague from the library, a woman I'd worked with for over 20 years, who mentioned it, almost in passing, over the phone one afternoon. She said she'd heard of a situation, a man, a widower, apparently quite wealthy, looking for a companion arrangement, her word, of a specific and limited nature. She said she hadn't thought of me until just now, and she was sorry if it was inappropriate, and she'd understand completely if I wanted to pretend she'd never said it. I told her to give me the number. The office where I met him was on the 14th floor of a building in downtown Toronto. Very clean, very quiet, the kind of quiet that costs money. I took the elevator up in my good wool coat, the navy one I save for funerals and interviews, and I told myself that if I felt for one single moment like I was about to do something I couldn't come back from, I would press the button for the lobby and go home. I did not press the button. His name was Clifton. No, wait, I'm sorry, I need to back up. I arrived and was shown to a small meeting room by a young man who offered me water and didn't make eye contact. I sat down, I waited, and then the door opened and a man walked in who was nothing like what I had imagined. I don't know what I'd imagined. Something cartoonish, probably. Someone who looked like a person making an unusual business arrangement. Someone easy to dislike. He was perhaps 70, tall and slightly stooped, the way tall men sometimes get when they've spent decades trying not to loom over people. Silver-haired. He wore a dark jacket, no tie and leather gloves. Black, close-fitting, the kind that cover the wrist. He didn't offer to shake hands. He simply sat down across from me, opened a folder, and said, "You've been told the general terms. I'd like to know why you're here." No preamble. No small talk. I respected that, even then. I told him about my grandson, all of it. The diagnosis, the trial in Montreal, the number my daughter had written on a piece of paper and handed me without meeting my eyes. I told him I was 64 years old and had spent my career in a public library and that I had no particular skills relevant to this situation, except that I kept my word and I was not easily rattled. I told him I wasn't looking for anything except what he was offering and that I intended to be straightforward with him in every interaction for however long this arrangement lasted. He listened without interrupting. Then he looked at me for a long moment. "A legal marriage," he said. 1 year. "I need a companion for social and medical purposes. My condition requires oversight. I travel infrequently, so the arrangement would be primarily based at my property outside Collingwood. You would have your own space, your privacy, and full access to a vehicle. At the end of the year, an uncontested divorce. You leave with $250,000 and whatever dignity you brought in." I sat with that for a moment. You said medical purposes, I said. What's the condition? He glanced down at his hands. The gloves. He seemed to notice me noticing. Something chronic, he said. It requires monitoring. You'll have everything you need to know in the agreement. Then he closed the folder and said, you can take a week to decide. I told him I'd call him in 2 days. I called him in 1. The house outside Collingwood was not what I expected either. I'd pictured something imposing, gates and pillars, the visual vocabulary of wealth showing off. It was none of that. It was a large stone farmhouse set back from a country road surrounded by old-growth trees. Inside, it smelled like wood and something faintly medicinal. Like the air had a history of being carefully managed, the rooms were well furnished and deeply quiet. There was a housekeeper who came 3 times a week, a man named Bertrand, who handled the property, and otherwise it was just the 2 of us. We established early that we were not pretending anything to each other inside the house. In public, the few times there were public obligations, we were a couple. Married, late in life, in the way that sometimes happens when people have already lived the loud parts of their lives and just want something steady. We were told it was believable. I think because neither of us performed it. We were just 2 people, slightly formal with each other, being polite. He cooked on Tuesdays and Thursdays. I didn't ask why those days specifically. He made things that were simple and considered soups, braised meats, things that didn't require much salt. He always wore the gloves, in the kitchen, in the sitting room, at the table. Always. I noticed, of course. You can't not notice. But I'd agreed to take what he told me in the contract at face value, and the contract said chronic condition, ongoing treatment, and I was not his nurse, and this was not my business. Except, one Thursday evening, about 6 weeks in, I came downstairs at 2:30 in the morning because I couldn't sleep. I'd been on the phone with my daughter for hours, and she'd told me the trial dates in Montreal had been confirmed, and I was too relieved and too anxious to settle, and I heard something from the direction of his study. A sound. Muffled. Not quite a groan, not quite a word. The kind of sound someone makes when they're trying very hard not to make a sound. I stood in the hallway for a moment. I am not a woman who panics. 30 years in a library teaches you to be useful in a quiet way or to get out of the way entirely. I knocked twice, lightly, and said his name. Silence. I turned the handle. The door wasn't locked. He was on the floor next to his desk, one hand braced against the leg of the chair, trying to push himself up. He'd fallen. The desk lamp had been knocked sideways and was casting everything at a strange angle. He looked up when I came in, and something moved across his face. Embarrassment, I think, the specific mortification of being seen in a helpless moment by someone you've been carefully controlled around. I crossed the room and crouched beside him and put my hand on his arm and said, "What do you need?" He exhaled. "I just need a moment." "Take as many as you like," I said. "I'm not going anywhere." And then I saw his hands. He had caught himself when he fell, and the glove on his right hand had pulled loose at the wrist. Not off entirely, just enough. Just enough for me to see the skin underneath. Scarred. Not from a single injury, but from something prolonged, something that had happened to the tissue over time. Graft versus host, maybe, or burns, or something else I didn't have the name for. The skin was pale and irregular, and looked as though it had been remade imperfectly over something that hurt. He noticed me looking. He didn't pull the glove back. He just said quietly, "An accident, 22 years ago." And then he said nothing else. I helped him into his chair. I righted the lamp. I asked if he wanted me to call anyone, and he said no. I asked if he'd like tea, and he said yes. I went to the kitchen and made it, and I brought it back, and I sat across from him in the armchair by the window, and we didn't say much. Just drank our tea in the odd half-light of 3 in the morning. After a while he said, "You didn't ask. You'll tell me what you want to tell me," I said. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "My wife. She was driving. I was in the passenger seat. There was ice on the highway just north of Barrie. We were coming back from our daughter's. She'd just had her first child, our first grandchild." He stopped. "My wife didn't survive. My hands were. I was trying to." He stopped again. I didn't say anything. Sometimes the most important thing you can offer is the absence of the thing someone expects you to say. "I stopped going out," he said, gradually at first, then almost entirely. "People look at the hands. They always look." He glanced down at them in his lap, the damaged one still half uncovered. I found it easier to simply arrange my life so that looking wasn't required of anyone. Including, I realized, me. That was what the contract was, at least in part. a way to have someone present without having to be looked at. I thought about all the Tuesdays and Thursdays in the kitchen, the soups, the way he stood with his back to me while he stirred things, the care he took with small routines. "Can I ask you something?" I said. He nodded. "Your grandchild. The one who was just born when," I paused. "Do you see them?" A long silence. "She's 22 now," he said. "She lives in Vancouver. She sends a card at Christmas. She is very polite." He said this in a way that meant something more than the words. "She doesn't know what to do with me. I don't blame her. I haven't made it easy." I thought about my grandson in Sudbury, about the Sunday phone calls, about the way an 11-year-old says goodbye on the phone, always in a hurry, always mid-thought about something else. I had never fully understood until that moment what a gift that carelessness was. After that night, things shifted, not dramatically. It wasn't like a door being thrown open. It was more like a window being cracked, just enough to let something in. He started leaving the study door open in the evenings. I started making the tea without being asked. We began, tentatively, to talk, not about the arrangement, not about the logistics of the year, but about actual things. He'd spent 30 years in commercial real estate development. He'd built affordable housing projects in Northern Ontario in the 80s and 90s. Something I hadn't expected, something that seemed to quietly contradict the image of a man who had walled himself off from the world. He asked me about the library, what I missed about it. I told him I missed the particular quiet of a place that holds thousands of voices and still manages to be peaceful. He seemed to understand that. One evening in April, he told me about his daughter. She lived in Halifax. They spoke occasionally, formally, the way people speak when love has curdled into something careful. She had been angry at him for a long time, for pulling away after the accident, for making her grieve her mother and her father simultaneously, he said. "She told me once that I made her feel like she'd lost me too." I told her she was being dramatic. He shook his head. "I was wrong about that." I told him it wasn't too late to say so. He looked at me with something between hope and terror. What would I even say? "The truth," I said. "Just exactly what you said to me just now." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You make it sound simple." "It isn't," I said. "But simple and easy aren't the same thing. The year moved the way time moves when you're in the middle of something you didn't plan to matter. Slowly and then not slowly at all. My grandson began his treatment in Montreal in March. My daughter sent me updates, photographs sometimes of him in the hospital room looking annoyed about the IV, which I took as a very good sign. He had my father's stubbornness. I'd always been grateful for that. In June, my husband, I had started privately to think of him as my husband, without the quotation marks I'd been placing around the word, drove me to Sudbury to see my grandson. He waited in the car. I didn't ask him to come in. But when I came back 2 hours later, red-eyed and wrung out and deeply relieved because my grandson had sat up in bed and told me in great detail about a hockey trade he felt personally betrayed by, my husband handed me a thermos of tea. "How is he?" he said. I told him. He listened the way he always listened, with his whole attention, which I had come to understand was the thing he did instead of reaching out touching someone. "He sounds like someone worth fighting for," he said. I looked at him, at the hands on the steering wheel, at the profile of a man who had spent 22 years deciding he was too broken to be looked at. "So do you," I said. He didn't answer. But he didn't look away either. In August, he called his daughter in Halifax. I don't know exactly what he said. I was in the garden when it happened, pulling up the overgrown lavender along the south wall, and I came inside an hour later to find him sitting at the kitchen table, looking like a man who had just done something he should have done a decade ago, and was quietly devastated by the distance in between. He told me she'd cried. He told me she'd asked why it took so long. He told me he hadn't had an answer that was good enough, so he'd just said, "I know, I'm sorry, I want to try." I sat down across from him. "That was the right answer," I said. "She wants to come at Thanksgiving," he said. He seemed stunned by this, like it hadn't occurred to him that saying the thing might actually work. "Good," I said. His daughter came at Thanksgiving. She was in her late 40s, with her father's height and her mother's eyes, which I knew from the photograph on the mantel that he'd put back up sometime in September. She was guarded with him, as you'd expect. You don't undo years of silence into weekend. But she wasn't unkind. We sat in the kitchen the first evening and she asked me, carefully, how we'd met. I gave her the shortened version. A mutual connection, later in life, things happening the way they sometimes do. She watched her father while I talked, and I could see her trying to reconcile the man she was looking at with the one she'd been grieving. After dinner, while he was washing up, she came to find me in the sitting room and said quietly, "He's different than I expected." "He seems present," I said. "He is." She looked toward the kitchen. "What changed?" I thought about it. "I think he just got tired of being alone," I said. "And someone happened to be there." She nodded slowly. "Thank you," she said, "for whatever it is you did." I didn't know how to explain that I hadn't done anything exactly. I'd just made tea and stayed in the room. The year ended in November. We sat across from each other at the kitchen table on a Tuesday, a cooking night, which felt right, and we talked about the process. The lawyer, the paperwork. He had already transferred the funds, as agreed, weeks before. My grandson was in remission. The word still felt dangerous to say out loud, like if I said it too many times it might take it back. But the doctors were cautiously optimistic, which in my experience is as good as it gets. He asked me what I would do next. "Go back to Sudbury," I said. "Be near my family, maybe volunteer at the library, part-time." He nodded. "That sounds right for you," he said. I asked him what he would do. He looked down at his hands on the table. He wasn't wearing the gloves. He'd stopped gradually around the house, not all at once, and he still wore them in public. But here, in the kitchen on a Tuesday, there were no gloves, just his hands, and I had looked at them so many times by now that they were simply his hands. "My granddaughter," he said, "in Vancouver. I thought I might reach out. Properly. Not a formal letter, something more like a conversation." He said this carefully, like he was still deciding if he was allowed to want it. "Do it," I said. He looked up. "Life is short," I said, "and then it's shorter than you expected, and you don't want to spend the time you have left making things too neat to be warm." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I want to say something, and I need you to let me finish before you respond." I waited. "I know this was an arrangement," he said. "I know what we agreed, and I know what you came for, and I respect all of it entirely. But I want you to know that this year, being seen in this house by someone who didn't flinch." He stopped, cleared his throat. I don't quite have the word for what that meant. I thought about telling him I understood. I thought about saying something practical, something that would make it easier for both of us. Instead, I said, "I'm glad I came upstairs that night." He nodded, just once. But it was enough. I drove back to Sudbury on a Saturday in late November, the highway gray and familiar under a heavy sky. My daughter met me at the door. My grandson was home and tired, but home, and he was standing behind her in his socks looking at me like he wasn't sure if he was supposed to hug me or just act normal, which is how 11-year-olds manage the things that are too big for them. I made the decision for him. I walked in and pulled him close and didn't say anything at all for a while. Later that night, after dinner, after my daughter had gone to do the dishes, and my grandson had retreated to his room with his tablet and his noise-canceling headphones, I sat at the kitchen table, and I thought about a man in a stone farmhouse outside Collingwood, maybe sitting in the kitchen on a Tuesday, maybe reaching for the phone. I hoped he made the call. I hoped whoever answered was ready to be surprised. Some people show you who they are through what they're willing to carry alone, year after year, because they think it protects the people they love. Sometimes, the most startling, fuzzing thing you can do for someone like that, the thing that costs you almost nothing but means everything to them, is simply to stay in the room and not look away. I wasn't trying to save anyone that year. I was trying to save my grandson, but I think maybe we saved a few things we didn't expect to, and that, I've decided, is enough.